Razor and Mackey. Two names that ruled Liverpool's streets with fear, cunning and violence. One built his empire on brute force, the other on strategy and betrayal. In the shadows of L8, their battle wasn't just for territory. It was for survival, loyalty, and the soul of the city itself. This is the story of the drug lords who turned a quiet neighborhood into a battlefield. Liverpool's L8 district had long been a neighborhood defined by its history and close-knit community. Rows of red brick terraced houses lined narrow streets, and small corner shops provided the daily pulse of life. Children played football on the sidewalks, neighbors exchanged greetings, and the rhythms of everyday life seemed predictable and safe. But beneath that ordinary surface, a shadow was quietly growing, a shadow that few residents could see at first. It began subtly. Unmarked cars were parked overnight near familiar street corners, often with windows tinted so dark that no one could see inside. Stranger figures lingered around shopfronts, watching the comings and goings of locals. Small, seemingly insignificant crimes began to creep into the neighborhood. A stolen bicycle here, a smashed window there. Most residents dismissed these incidents as random acts of mischief, the kind of petty problems any city experienced, but in truth, they were signs of something much darker, something that would eventually turn the district upside down. In the shadows of L8, a battle for control over the city's drug trade was quietly taking shape. Two rival gangs, each determined to dominate, were carving out territories with careful precision. One was led by a man known only as Razor, whose reputation for violence and intimidation preceded him. His followers were loyal and ruthless, and his name alone could make even hardened criminals pause. The other was headed by Mackey, a man who relied more on strategy than brute force. Mackey understood the power of money, secrecy, and manipulation, and he was patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At first, their rivalry was invisible to most of the public. Drug deals happened in abandoned warehouses, and behind closed doors in pubs. Couriers carried small packages across the district, blending seamlessly into the city's daily life. Teenagers, drawn by promises of easy money, were recruited as lookouts and runners, unknowingly stepping into a dangerous world that could destroy them. Residents noticed only glimpses of this hidden activity, a group of young men loitering near a school, a sudden rise in vandalism, or the occasional outburst of violence late at night. But they rarely pieced these signs together. By the end of the year, the presence of these gangs had begun to reshape the very fabric of L8. Streets that were once filled with laughter and community events grew quiet after dark. Shopkeepers installed additional locks and security cameras, fearful of confrontations they didn't fully understand. Parents worried when their children didn't return home on time, sensing that an unseen danger had taken root in their neighborhood. Even the local police, stretched thin and struggling to prioritize cases, began receiving increasing reports of suspicious activity, though the full scale of the problem remained hidden beneath layers of secrecy. What made the situation in L8 especially dangerous was the sense of invisibility surrounding it. The gangs operated quietly, almost invisibly, while the damage they caused rippled through the community. By the time the first real signs of a turf war appeared, the streets of L8 had already been reshaped. Fear had begun to creep into the neighborhood, but it was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Windows were left shut, doors were locked earlier in the evening, and neighbors stopped chatting as openly in the streets. The quiet tension was a warning, a signal that something was brewing, though no one could predict the scale of the storm that was about to hit. Police found themselves struggling to keep up. The gangs operated like well-oiled machines, with lookout networks that included teenagers who were too young to be legally prosecuted. Couriers carried small packages through the city, blending in with ordinary pedestrians, while gang leaders met in abandoned warehouses and empty warehouses where surveillance cameras were useless. Every time authorities thought they had a lead, the information turned out to be deliberately misleading. Mackey, in particular, was skilled at manipulating the flow of information, using spies and traitors to destabilize Razor's organization without ever engaging in direct confrontation. As the year progressed, The violence began to affect residents in ways they could no longer ignore. Children on the streets grew wary of strangers, and parents warned their teenagers to avoid certain neighborhoods entirely. Community centers and youth programs reported a sharp rise in drug-related problems, and even small shops began hiring private security for protection. It was no longer just about stolen bikes or petty vandalism. The drugs trade had infiltrated everyday life, and fear was becoming part of the fabric of the district. The tipping point came when a major cocaine shipment vanished during transit. Razor, furious and convinced of betrayal, demanded retaliation. Mackey, who had orchestrated the theft behind the scenes, used it as a masterstroke to destabilize his rival's operations. Violence escalated rapidly after that. Cars were torched, warehouses raided, and even bystanders were caught in the crossfire. The district that had once been known for its quiet streets now echoed with sirens, shouting, and the occasional gunshot. Every corner of L8 became a contested zone. Razor's gang relied on fear and intimidation, making examples out of anyone who questioned their authority. Mackey's crew, in contrast, used strategy, bribery, and manipulation to erode Razor's influence from within. Ordinary residents found themselves trapped between these two forces, unsure who to trust, and terrified of becoming collateral damage in a war they had never asked to be part of. The stakes were rising higher than ever before. The once hidden underworld had grown bold, and no one in L8 was safe. Shops that had operated for decades closed their doors. Young people were drawn into the conflict without realizing the danger, and even the police were forced to adapt to a city where criminals outsmarted law enforcement at every turn. What had started as subtle signs of criminal activity had now become an all-out battle for control of Liverpool's streets. By the end of the year, it was clear that L8 would never be the same again. Razor and Mackey were no longer just names whispered on street corners. They were symbols of fear, strategy, and the ruthless pursuit of power. And as the turf war continued to escalate, one thing became certain. The district had entered a new era, where loyalty could mean survival and betrayal could mean death. Every resident of L8 was living on the edge, caught between two unstoppable forces, and the war for the city's underworld was only just beginning. The rivalry between Razor and Mackey had grown into more than just a battle over territory. It had become a psychological war, one fought in the shadows as much as on the streets. Both gangs were aware that power depended not only on violence but on trust, or rather the careful manipulation of it. Razor's crew, once cohesive and intimidating, began to fracture from within. Fear had become a constant companion, and suspicion gnawed at even the most loyal members. Every missed call, every unexplained absence, became a potential sign of betrayal. Mackey understood this weakness better than anyone. While Razor relied on brute force and public intimidation, Mackey moved quietly, planting seeds of doubt and misinformation. He manipulated alliances, whispered rumors of secret deals, and turned friends into enemies without ever raising a hand. Members of Razor's gang started questioning each other, unsure who was truly loyal and who had already switched sides. Trust, which had once been the backbone of Razor's operations, became a fragile illusion. The turning point came with a shocking revelation. One of Razor's most trusted lieutenants, someone who had been with him since the beginning, was discovered to have been feeding Mackey information for months. This betrayal went beyond simple espionage. It allowed Mackey to anticipate Razor's every move, intercept shipments, and orchestrate attacks that left Razor's organization scrambling. The lieutenant had provided critical intelligence on meeting times, financial transactions, and safe houses, giving Mackey a strategic advantage that Razor could never have predicted. The impact of this betrayal was immediate. Razor's gang, already tense and fearful, began to unravel. Operations that had once run smoothly were thrown into chaos. Couriers were caught carrying drugs under Mackey's watchful eyes. Abandoned warehouses, once secure meeting points, were suddenly raided or burned. Razor's public displays of violence became more erratic, almost desperate, as he tried to reassert control over a network that had quietly turned against him. The streets of L8, already scarred by months of conflict, felt the effects instantly. Residents noticed an increase in violent incidents, felt the effects instantly. Residents noticed an increase in violent incidents, assaults and disappearances. Local businesses were targeted in what appeared to be random attacks, though in reality they were part of Mackey's careful strategy to destabilize Razor's influence. Fear, which had already been present, intensified. People stopped walking certain routes at night, children were kept indoors, and parents grew increasingly anxious about the neighborhood they had once considered safe. The betrayal also changed the nature of the war. Until this point, confrontations had been primarily between gangs, with the public largely as witnesses. But now, the fight became unpredictable. Mackey's reach extended into every corner of L8, and Razor's weakened position meant he could no longer protect even his most loyal followers. Attacks became bolder. Shipments went missing, and safe houses were no longer safe. The neighborhood, already teetering on the edge, seemed ready to collapse into chaos. For Razor, the discovery of the betrayal marked the beginning of a slow, inevitable downfall. His reputation for brutality, once a shield that kept rivals and traitors alike in check, could not withstand the erosion of trust from within. Mackey's advantage, gained through careful planning and the use of insiders, became the critical difference in the ongoing battle. While residents lived in growing fear, the gang's conflict had entered a new, more dangerous phase, one where unseen hands controlled outcomes and the rules of the underworld had shifted without warning. As the year drew on, it became clear that L8 had entered a new reality. The district was no longer just a backdrop for criminal activity. It was an active battlefield shaped by manipulation, strategy, and betrayal. Every street corner, every alley, and every abandoned building held the potential for violence. Razor's once feared empire was crumbling, and Mackey's influence was quietly expanding. Yet, even with this shift in power, the war was far from over. The residents of L8 would soon discover that in the world of Liverpool's underworld, betrayal was only the beginning, and survival depended on watching the shadows as closely as the streets themselves. Razor's empire, once feared across Liverpool, was beginning to collapse in ways that few could have predicted. The betrayal from within had shattered the foundation of his operations, and the chaos it caused spread through his organization like wildfire. Couriers vanished, shipments were intercepted, and safe houses were no longer safe. His gang, once disciplined and loyal, was now riddled with paranoia. Every glance, every whispered conversation, was interpreted as a potential threat. Razor's reputation for ruthless enforcement, which had once kept both allies and rivals in check, could no longer mask the cracks in his power. As law enforcement intensified raids on known gang territories, members of Razor's crew were arrested in rapid succession. These arrests were not just random. They had been facilitated by information leaked to Mackey's network. What had once been a series of isolated setbacks now became a chain reaction that threatened to dismantle Razor's entire operation. Banks were scrutinized, properties were frozen, and funds that had seemed untouchable were suddenly exposed. Razor's influence, built over years of careful intimidation and control, was evaporating almost overnight. Then came the most shocking turn of all. Razor himself vanished. One night he was simply gone. Rumors exploded across L8 and beyond. Some believed he had been murdered in retaliation for past offenses. Others suggested he had fled the city to escape the crumbling empire he had once ruled. There were whispers that he was planning a secret comeback, retreating into the shadows to gather resources and allies for a return that would shake the streets once more. No one knew the truth, and the uncertainty only added to the fear and tension gripping the district. What made Razor's disappearance even more dramatic was the revelation of betrayal at the highest levels. The lieutenant who had secretly worked for Mackey had not only fed information, but had actively orchestrated key events that led to Razor's downfall. This insider had ensured that Mackey was always one step ahead, predicting moves, intercepting shipments, and sabotaging operations from within. The double cross revealed how fragile loyalty could be in the world of Liverpool's underworld, where survival often depended on cunning rather than brute force. With Razor gone, Mackey seized the opportunity to consolidate his power. He expanded his territory, absorbing parts of Razor's former operations while maintaining a careful balance to avoid attracting too much police attention. Mackey's rule was strategic. He combined intimidation with subtle manipulation, keeping rival factions wary but under control. Streets once marked by chaos began to fall under his quiet but firm control, and even residents who had feared for their lives noticed a strange sense of order returning, though it was an order imposed by fear rather than justice. Yet even as Mackey appeared untouchable, signs of unrest persisted. Unexplained robberies, sporadic acts of violence, and whispers of rogue actors hinted that the war was far from over. Razor's absence did not mean the underworld of L8 was tamed. It simply meant that the battleground had shifted. New figures, emboldened by the vacuum, began emerging, eager to challenge Mackey's growing dominance. The streets of L8, scarred by months of conflict, remained unpredictable, and every resident knew that the balance of power could change at any moment. By the end of this chapter in L8's history, the district had been transformed. Razor's downfall marked the collapse of one of Liverpool's most feared criminal empires, while Mackey's rise highlighted the cunning and patience required to survive and thrive in the underworld. The once familiar streets had become a theater of strategy, betrayal and violence, leaving a lasting impression on the community. In L8, the story was no longer just about criminals. It was about power, fear, and the invisible forces that controlled the life of a city's streets. The battle for Liverpool's underworld had reached a new stage, and the shadows had only grown longer. By 2020, L8 was no longer just a neighborhood. It had become a symbol of Liverpool's struggle with organized crime. The streets that had once echoed with children playing and neighbors chatting now carried a quieter, heavier weight. Mackey, having seized control after Razor's downfall, ruled with a combination of fear, strategy, and careful manipulation. On the surface, there was order. The violence that had defined the turf war seemed to have subsided. But beneath that calm, the underworld continued to thrive, invisible yet deeply entrenched. The people of L8 had begun to adapt to this new reality. Shopkeepers fortified their businesses, parents kept a closer watch on their children, and community groups worked tirelessly to reclaim spaces that had been lost to criminal influence. Yet the scars of the war were everywhere. Abandoned houses, blackened by fires or left empty after families moved away, stood as reminders of the chaos that had consumed the district. The atmosphere of fear lingered, a subtle but constant presence that shaped daily life. Even when Mackey appeared untouchable, residents knew that power in the underworld was fragile and ever-shifting. The story of Razor and Mackey became a cautionary tale. Razor's disappearance and ultimate collapse demonstrated how quickly even the most feared criminal empire could crumble when loyalty was broken. Mackey's rise illustrated the deadly combination of intelligence, patience, and manipulation required to dominate a city's underworld. For young people drawn to the promise of easy money and status, the tale served as both warning and temptation, proof that power came at a price few survived to pay. Despite Mackey's dominance, new threats began to emerge almost immediately. The vacuum left by Razor's downfall had inspired ambitious outsiders, eager to carve their own territories. Sporadic acts of violence, unexplained robberies, and silent disappearances reminded residents that the war for control had never truly ended. The streets of L8 had become a perpetual chessboard, where every move could trigger a violent response, and where alliances shifted as cyclic as fortunes. Even the most cautious residents were forced to navigate a world where danger could appear at any corner, and trust had become a scarce commodity. The legacy of the underworld extended beyond crime and violence. It affected the very identity of L8. Families who had lived there for generations reconsidered their future, and businesses hesitated to invest in a district known for its shadowy power struggles. Yet, amid the fear, there were signs of resilience. Community members refused to be completely silenced, organizing local initiatives to reclaim their streets. Small victories like restored parks, reopened shops, and neighborhood watches offered hope that life in L8 could improve, even as the underworld persisted in the background. What made L8's story particularly haunting was the sense that the battle for the underworld was never truly over. Razor's empire had fallen, Mackey had risen, but the forces that fueled these conflicts, the greed, ambition, and willingness to betray, remained. Each resident, knowingly or not, had become a witness to a world that thrived in secrecy, a world that could erupt into chaos at any moment. The scars on the streets and the memories of fear left an indelible mark, shaping how people moved, who they trusted, and how they envisioned the future of their city. In the end, L8 stood as a district transformed by power, betrayal, and survival. The quiet that settled over the streets was not peace, but the fragile calm of a battlefield momentarily at rest. The war for Liverpool's underworld had left its mark, proving that control, loyalty, and fear were currencies far more valuable than money. And while Razor's story ended in mystery and Mackey's dominance continued, one truth remained clear. In L8, the underworld's shadow was never far, and the battle for the streets was only ever a heartbeat away.